The Frankfurt Judengasse in the spring of 1812 was a narrow lane of locked gates and tall houses pressed shoulder to shoulder against the Christian city beyond. In one of those houses, an old man was dying, and on his deathbed he was writing a constitution. Mayer Amschel Rothschild had spent his life building a banking system out of nothing more than a coin shop, a coat of arms borrowed from a red shield over his door, and 5 sons. Now, with the strength remaining to him, he was binding those sons together for the centuries he would not live to see. His will, drafted in the final weeks of his life, was less a testament than a treaty. 5 sons would take 5 cities: Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Naples, Paris. Daughters would inherit money but not power. Sons-in-law would have no share in the business. The bank would belong to the male line and the male line alone, and the male line would marry inside itself wherever possible, so that the fortune would never leave the bundle. The motto stitched into the family crest would be Concordia, Integritas, Industria, Unity, Integrity, Industry, and the crest itself would carry 5 arrows in a single fist, drawn from the 127th Psalm, the one that compares children to arrows in the hand of a mighty man. For 2 centuries, the bundle held. The Rothschilds bought the Bank of England out of panic and bought peerages out of perseverance. They built chateaux across the Buckinghamshire Downs and on the gravel banks of Bordeaux. They wrote to one another in Judendeutsch, German written in Hebrew letters, sending more than 20,000 letters between the 5 capitals, every one of which now sits in the family archive in London. They fixed the price of gold at a small Georgian building in St. Swithin's Lane and held that price every working morning for nearly 200 years. They funded railways and reparations, they paid for the freedom of 2 slave colonies, they advanced the loans that purchased the Suez Canal, and in the closing days of the First World War, one of them received a letter that would be folded into the founding documents of a state. Yet the same forces that built the bundle kept producing people who could not live inside it. The closed faith broke daughters who fell in love outside it. The patrilineal bank broke sons who had no instinct for finance. The dynastic expectation, pressed onto small shoulders generation after generation, broke children who had been born for it and who could not, in the end, carry what they had been born to carry. There were Rothschild heirs who walked out of the bank to chase butterflies. There were Rothschild daughters who walked out of marriages to chase jazz musicians through the segregated motels of the American South. There were Rothschild sons who walked into Paris hotel bathrooms and did not walk out again. Today we follow 4 of them across 2 centuries. A Victorian daughter who chose love over faith, an Edwardian eldest son who chose tortoises over treasury bonds, a post-war baroness who chose bebop over the diplomatic corps, and a contemporary heir who, at 41, on a July evening in Paris, chose nothing at all. The system had been designed for permanence. These were the ones who could not be made permanent. Hannah Mayer Rothschild was the first apostate. She was the dynasty's test case for what happened to those who broke the rules. The brilliant, harp-playing, Rossini-tutored daughter of the most powerful banker in London, who chose a Christian gentleman over the bundle, and who discovered that the bundle does not forgive its escapees so much as it slowly, patiently, bureaucratically erases them. She represents the cost of endogamy made flesh and the precise mechanism by which a family that prided itself on unity dealt with the ones who could not stay inside it. She was born on the 10th of March 1815 at New Court, the St. Swithin's Lane offices that her father Nathan Mayer Rothschild had turned into the operational heart of the London branch. Nathan was the 3rd of Mayer Amschel's sons, the one who had been sent to Manchester and then to London with a sum of money and an instruction to build a banking house out of textile arbitrage and government bonds. He had succeeded so completely that by the time Hannah was born, the London Rothschilds were richer than the Bank of England's directors and were beginning, quietly, to bankroll Europe. Hannah's mother, also called Hannah, was Hannah Baron Cohen, daughter of one of the wealthiest Jewish merchants in London. The household moved from the offices to Stamford Hill and then, in 1835, to Gunnersbury Park, the riverside estate Nathan bought as a country retreat. There, surrounded by lawns and orangeries, Hannah Mayer was given the education of a princess of finance. She studied voice with Gioacchino Rossini, then the most famous composer in Europe. She played a gold harp her father had commissioned for her, and the celebrated Spanish harpist Parrish Alvas dedicated his Serenade Opus 83 to her playing. She was charming, accomplished, and by the standards of any drawing room in Mayfair, eligible. She was also, by the standards of her family, only eligible to marry a Rothschild. Nathan died in 1836, and his will placed Hannah and her sisters under the joint guardianship of their mother and their brothers, with the surviving uncles holding final say over any marriage. The strategy, articulated repeatedly in letters between the brothers, was simple. Cousins. Always cousins. The fortune was to stay inside the bundle. Of the 21 marriages contracted by Mayer Amschel's grandchildren, 15 would eventually be Rothschild to Rothschild, including 4 pairs of first cousins. Hannah's uncle James in Paris had already married his own niece Betty 12 years earlier, in 1824, establishing the template. But Hannah, in the closing years of the 1830s, had met someone outside the template. The Honourable Henry Fitzroy was the second son of the second Baron Southampton, a great-great-great-great-grandson of Charles II, through one of the King's illegitimate lines. He was 32, charming, classically educated, broadly liberal in his politics, and entirely Anglican. He was, in every dimension that mattered to the Rothschild brothers, unsuitable. The family applied pressure. Fitzroy was asked to leave the country, and he did, sailing for Athens and Constantinople for a 6-month tour intended to allow Hannah's resolve to weaken. It did not weaken. When he returned in early 1839, she was still waiting. James in Paris wrote in fury to his nephew Lionel, "To renounce our religion," he said, "the religion of our father Rabbi Mayer Rothschild of blessed memory, the religion which, thank God, made us so great." This was something the family could not countenance, could not survive, could not permit. He tried to lure Hannah to Switzerland to break the engagement at distance. She refused. On the morning of the 29th of April, 1839, a carriage left the Rothschild house on Piccadilly and made its way through the spring streets of Mayfair to the colonnaded portico of St. George's, Hanover Square. The bride was inside it with her mother, the widow Hannah Baron Cohen Rothschild, who had buried her husband 3 years earlier and who now sat beside her daughter for what would be the last unambiguous act of family loyalty either of them would experience. The carriage halted at the church gates. The mother said she would go no further. Imagine the silence inside the carriage in those few seconds. The daughter who had been taught Italian opera by Rossini, who had played a gold harp for the salons of Mayfair, who had been raised in the certainty that she belonged to a family larger and older than any nation she lived in, sitting beside the woman who had given her all of that, and who was now refusing to walk her up the aisle. Hannah descended alone. The only Rothschild to enter the church was her brother Nathaniel, who slipped in by another door. The Anglican vows were said in a building no Rothschild had ever entered for such a purpose. When Hannah Mayer Fitzroy, as she was now called, walked back out into the April light, she was no longer, in any meaningful family sense, a Rothschild at all. The Times noted the event a few days later with characteristic understatement. It was, the paper observed, the first instance of a member of the Rothschild family abandoning the faith of their fathers. James, writing from Paris to the brothers, was less restrained. "We shall therefore wipe her from our memory," he instructed, "and never again during my lifetime will I or any other member of our family see or receive her." We now want to wish her all the best and banish her from our memory as if she had never existed. The financial mechanics followed. Hannah retained £12,500 from Nathan's will and a further £12,500 from her majority. Together, in modern terms, somewhere near £3 million. But the marriage clause in Nathan's will had been clear, and a £50,000 dowry invested at 4% in the family bank was forfeit. That sum, in today's money, exceeds £6.5 million. The Fitzroys, on their side, also reduced Henry's allowance. The young couple, on paper still rich by any standard but theirs, found themselves living the comfortable but distinctly trimmed existence of the merely well-off. The exile was real, but it was not eternal. By the late 1840s, the family had begun to reach back. Aunt Betty, James's wife, made what she called her peace with Hannah on a Paris visit in 1849. Lionel began sending presents to her children. Henry Fitzroy rose through the Liberal ranks and ended his career as First Commissioner of Works under Palmerston. He died in Brighton in December 1859, age 52. Their 15-year-old son, Arthur, had died the previous year after a riding accident, a loss Hannah's niece Constance described in the family correspondence as a punishment for having deserted the faith of the fathers. The verdict was harsh and probably unfair, but it captured something real about how the family understood Hannah's life. A woman who had broken the bundle had been punished not by men but by Providence, and the children paid for the mother's choice. Hannah herself died on the night of the 1st of December 1864 at 42 Upper Grosvenor Street in Mayfair. She had been ill for most of that year. Charlotte de Rothschild, in a letter to a cousin, described an enormous swelling on her back like a hump of a camel, and the cause was almost certainly a malignant tumour. She was 49. She was buried on instruction of her husband's family at Hanwell Cemetery, beside the Fitzroys. The Rothschilds, those who attended, came as visitors rather than as kin. She had crossed the church gates, her mother would not, and her grave at Hanwell would lie miles from the Rothschild stones at Willesden, the geography of her break made literal in the soil. Walter Rothschild was the heir who could not be an heir. He was the eldest son of an empire who preferred giant tortoises to gold, and he represents the cost of patrilineal succession on the wrong shoulders. A 6'3" stammering naturalist groomed for the City of London, who built instead the largest private natural history collection ever assembled, and who paid, in the end, for 40 years of blackmail with the bones of dead birds. He was born on the 8th of February 1868 at 148 Piccadilly, the Italianate marble mansion his father Natty had built on the corner of Hyde Park. Natty was Nathan Mayer Rothschild II, the first practising Jew to take a hereditary seat in the House of Lords, the man whose loan of £4 million to Disraeli's government in 1875 had bought Britain its controlling stake in the Suez Canal in the course of a single afternoon. He was a banker of monumental seriousness, and when his eldest son Walter was born, the boy was being measured, almost from the cradle, for the chair at the head of the table at New Court. The boy who appeared, however, was not the boy who had been ordered. By the age of 7, Walter had announced his life's plan to his parents over a Tring breakfast. "Mama, Papa," he said, "I'm going to make a museum." By the age of 10, he had one, a single shed in the gardens of Tring Park, the family's 100-room country house in Hertfordshire, staffed by Alfred Meynell, the family joiner, who had been quietly seconded to the boy's purposes. He was painfully shy. He stammered. His brother Charles described him as oscillating between complete silence and loud, emphatic bellowing. He grew eventually to 6 feet 3 inches and around 20 stone, and he never fit comfortably into a banker's chair, a London carriage, or a conventional sentence. He was sent to Magdalen College, Cambridge, with a flock of kiwis. He took, by reasonable accounts, 20 live birds and an unspecified quantity of beetles. He returned without a degree. In 1889, his father pressed him into N.M. Rothschild and Sons, the bank at New Court. Walter spent 18 years there, by all accounts unhappily and largely uselessly. The most famous incident of his banking career was the morning 2 live bear cubs were delivered to the steps of the bank in his name, an event that the partners regarded as funny precisely once. He spent his days, when not bellowing at clerks, writing taxonomic papers on cassowaries and corresponding with collectors in the Galapagos and the Solomon Islands. In 1892, with his father's reluctant permission, he opened the Walter Rothschild Zoological Museum on the grounds at Tring. By the end of his life, it would house 300,000 bird skins, 200,000 eggs, 2.25 million butterflies, and 30,000 beetles, the largest private natural history collection ever assembled. The collection survives today, transferred after his death, as the bird wing of the Natural History Museum. The eccentricities went further. In 1898, Walter drove a carriage through London pulled by 4 Burchell's zebras, 3 of his own breeding and 1 borrowed, in order to demonstrate that the species could be tamed. He drove this carriage to Buckingham Palace, where the future King George V was permitted briefly to take the reins. Walter kept 144 giant tortoises at Tring, some of which he rode for the amusement of visiting children. He leased the entire Aldabra Atoll in the Indian Ocean, an act of conservation 40 years ahead of its time, in order to protect its tortoise population. In 1902, he imported a colony of edible dormice from Hungary. Their descendants now number something like 10,000 and live wild in the Chiltern Hills. Picture, somewhere in the middle of all this, the unnamed peeress beginning to write her letters. She was, according to Walter's niece Miriam, the only person who ever fully encountered her, charming, witty, aristocratic, and ruthless. She and her husband had identified Walter early, a vast inheritance, a paralytic shyness, a horror of public scandal, a streak of romantic credulity. The blackmail began sometime in the early 1890s and continued almost without interruption for the next 40 years. Marie Fredenson and Lizzie Ritchie, the 2 manageable mistresses Walter kept in separate London flats, were costly but containable. The peeress was something else, a relationship that would, before its end, cost him the very birds that bore his name. In 1908, Natty cut him out of the will and removed his portrait from the partners' room at New Court. Walter, with what appears to have been genuine relief, left the bank for good. He admitted later to his sister-in-law that his father had been absolutely right, that he could not be trusted with money. He retreated full-time to Tring. He continued to publish, done over 1,200 scientific papers in his lifetime, describing more than 5,000 new species. He helped found the journal Novitates Zoologicae. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1911. And in the autumn of 1931, sitting at his curatorial desk in the Tring Museum, surrounded by the wicker baskets of the peeress's unanswered letters, he made the calculation that the only asset he still possessed, which was large enough to satisfy her, was the birds themselves. The correspondence with the American Museum of Natural History in New York began that winter. In 1932, 280,000 bird skins, the heart of the collection, the result of 40 years of expeditions, purchases, and quiet acquisitions across 6 continents, were crated up at Tring and shipped to Manhattan. The price was $225,000, less than a quarter of the dealer Roland Ward's market estimate. Miriam Rothschild, decades later, opening the locked baskets after Walter's death and discovering the proof of what the sale had been for, wrote that her uncle had seemed to shrink visibly in the period after it. "It was winter," she said. "The birds had flown. And here, against the pattern of decline, a moment of inverted significance. 3 weeks before this point in the script, in another video, we followed an 8-year-old Otto von Habsburg watching the gates of Schönbrunn close behind his train as the empire he had been born to vanished into the November mist of 1918. Then same year, Otto's father refused on a Madeira veranda to abdicate the imperial title that had already been taken from him. Walter Rothschild, the failed banker, the family disappointment, the man whose own father had crossed his name from the bank's portrait gallery, was holding in his hand a letter of 67 words that would redraw the modern Middle East. The arrows of inheritance, it turned out, sometimes pointed in directions no one had aimed. The letter was dated the 2nd of November 1917. It was addressed formally, "Dear Lord Rothschild," and it was sent to 148 Piccadilly. His Majesty's government, the Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote on behalf of the British War Cabinet, "View with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object." Walter, in his capacity as president of the British Zionist Federation, a position he held alongside the chemist Chaim Weizmann, had spent the preceding summer drafting and redrafting the formula with Balfour's office. The letter that emerged was the operational charter of a state that would, 31 years later, exist on a map. Walter donated the original manuscript to the British Library in 1924. It is there still. He died on the 27th of August, 1937, of cancer of the spinal cord, at Tring, age 69. He was buried at Willesden Jewish Cemetery. His tombstone carries a verse from the 12th chapter of the book of Job. "Ask of the beasts, and they will tell thee, and the birds of the air shall declare unto thee." The barony passed, since Walter had no legitimate children, to his nephew Victor, a man who would father, in his second marriage, the dynasty's next great rebel. A man who had been called useless by his own father had, with 67 words, given an answer to a question 2,000 years older than the bank he could not run. Pannonica Rothschild was the heir who walked out of the white-glove world of European aristocracy and into the segregated jazz clubs of post-war Manhattan. She represents the cost of dynastic sterility on a daughter who needed heir. A baroness who chose Charlie Parker over the diplomatic corps, a Bentley convertible over a chateau, and 100 rescue cats over the 5 arrows of the family crest. She was born on the 10th of December 1913 in London, and she was named for a moth. Her father, Charles Rothschild, was Walter's younger brother, and like Walter, an obsessive naturalist, though unlike Walter, he had not been allowed to escape the bank. Charles divided his time between Newcourt and the field, and on a collecting expedition to the Pannonian Plain in Central Europe, he had encountered a small noctuid moth, Eublema pannonica, which charmed him sufficiently that he gave its name to his 4th and youngest daughter. Thelonious Monk, decades later, when the friendship between him and that daughter was at its height, insisted with characteristic certainty that the name referred to a butterfly. Nika did not correct him. When Nika was 10 years old, on the 12th of October 1923, her father Charles locked himself in his bathroom at Ashton Wold, the family's country house in Northamptonshire, and cut his own throat. The cause was officially encephalitis, undiagnosed depression, and a recurrence of the influenza that had nearly killed him in 1916. The phrase for what he had done was not used in the family, a family antecedent that would, 3/4 of a century later, be cited at the inquest of his own grandson. Nika was the youngest of his 4 children. Her brother Victor was 13, her sister Miriam 15. She grew up between Tring, Ashton Wold, and the long summer visits to Waddesdon, the Loire-style chateau her great-uncle Ferdinand had built on a Buckinghamshire hill. There were free roaming kangaroos at Tring, courtesy of Uncle Walter. There were rooms full of Sèvres porcelain at Waddesdon. There was, throughout, the particular silence her great-niece Hannah Rothschild would later describe as the blinds and curtains drawn to protect the art. Houses, Hannah wrote, that killed noise, even the noise of children. Nika, in adulthood, would describe her childhood mostly through the music she had not been allowed to listen to. In 1935, aged 21, she married Baron Jules de Koenigswarter, French, Jewish, a mining engineer by training, a widowed pilot, 11 years older. The marriage was approved on every dimension that mattered to a Rothschild marriage. They had 3 children before the war and would have 2 more after it. Jules joined the Free French in 1940. Nika, with the war closing over France, sent the 3 children to safety with the Guggenheim cousins on Long Island and recrossed the Atlantic on a Norwegian freighter through U-boat-haunted waters to rejoin him. She broadcast for de Gaulle on Radio Brazzaville. She drove an ambulance for the 1st Free French Division across North and Central Africa. She was decorated as a lieutenant. The cover photograph of Thelonious Monk's 1968 album Underground shows Nika decades later in resistance fatigues with a rifle, exactly as she had been in 1943. The war ended. Jules entered the French diplomatic service. Nika became for several years an ambassador's wife, postings to Norway, then to Mexico City. And then, on a visit to New York sometime in late 1948 or early 1949, the pianist Teddy Wilson played her a recording of a tune called Round Midnight, written by a man she had never heard of called Thelonious Monk. She played it, by her own later account, 20 times in a row. Picture the pastel blue Bentley convertible, the car that became her constant companion through the next 4 decades, that would shortly be nicknamed by every musician at Birdland the Bebop Bentley. Picture the Stanhope Hotel, 995 Fifth Avenue, opposite the Metropolitan Museum, where in 1951, after walking out of the Mexico City Embassy and her marriage, Nika took a permanent suite. Picture the late-night phone calls, from Charlie Parker, from Dizzy Gillespie, from Sonny Rollins, from Miles Davis, to a baroness who had begun with Rothschild money and no other plan, paying their rent, paying their bail, paying their hospital bills and driving them, in her blue Bentley, to gigs in cities where they would not otherwise have been allowed to sleep. On the 9th of March 1955, Charlie Parker, Bird, the founder of bebop, the alto saxophonist whose music had reordered American music, arrived at Nika's Stanhope suite gravely ill. He was 34. He had been drinking heavily for months. He had bleeding ulcers, advanced cirrhosis, and an undiagnosed pneumonia. Nika called her own doctor, Robert Fryman, who advised hospital. Bird refused. He stayed. On the evening of the 12th of March, 3 days into Nika's care, Bird was sitting on the couch in the Stanhope suite watching the Dorsey Brothers stage show on television, propped up against pillows, dressed in pajamas and a robe. Nika was in the next room. Slow this moment down. Imagine the suite. The Fifth Avenue light dimming through the curtains, the murmur of evening traffic on the avenue below, the small black and white screen, Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, the tune called Just Friends. Imagine the cough, a single cough that became a series of coughs, that became blood. Bird stood. He screamed. He fell at her feet. At the moment of his going, Nika wrote later, there was a tremendous clap of thunder. The coroner, called to the suite, estimated his age at 53. He had been 34. The tabloids the next morning ran the headline, "Bop King dies in Heiress's flat." The Stanhope evicted her within the week. She moved to the Bolivar, 230 Central Park West, a hotel which Monk would commemorate 2 years later in his composition, Bal Louis Bolivar, Bal Louis Are. On the 15th of October 1958, Nika was driving Monk and the saxophonist Charlie Rouse from New York to a gig in Baltimore in the blue Bentley. They stopped somewhere on US Route 13 south of Wilmington, Delaware, at a roadside motel for water. Monk, who had been awake on amphetamines for several days, was disoriented. The desk clerk called the state police. The troopers who arrived beat Monk with blackjacks for refusing to identify himself. They searched the Bentley and found in Nika's luggage approximately $10 worth of marijuana. Nika, looking at Monk on the floor of the motel, took the rap. She was sentenced on the 21st of April, 1959, to 3 years in a Delaware prison and a fine of $3,000. The conviction was overturned in 1962 by the Delaware Superior Court in the case of State versus de Koenigswarter, on the grounds that the search of her luggage had been conducted without valid consent. Asked about the episode years later, she dismissed it with a single sentence. "It was such a bore," she said. "I can't be bothered to talk about it." The final act played out across the Hudson. In 1958, Nika had bought a modernist house at 63 Kingswood Road in Weehawken, New Jersey, a glass and stone structure originally designed for the film director Josef von Sternberg, and overlooking from a high cliff the Manhattan skyline she had abandoned. Monk dubbed it Catsville for the musicians who slept on every floor. It became known eventually as the Cat House after the more than 100 rescue cats Nika accumulated there. Monk himself moved in for the last 6 years of his life in a state of profound mental illness, cared for jointly by Nika and his wife Nellie. He played the piano less and less. He spoke less and less. He died of a stroke at the Cat House on the 17th of February, 1982, age 64. Nika survived him by 6 years, dying after triple bypass surgery on the 30th of November, 1988, age 74. Her children scattered her ashes on the Hudson River at the request she had made years before, around midnight, in homage to the tune that had begun the whole second half of her life. Tunes named for her by the men she had carried across America in her Bentley include Monk's Pannonica, Horace Silver's Nika's Dream, Gigi Grice's Nika's Tempo, Sonny Clark's Nika, and Tommy Flanagan's Thalonica. The Rothschild Archive in London holds 300 Polaroids she took in the small hours of 700 New York mornings of musicians she had loved. She had been born into the world's quietest houses, and her life's work had been to give a world of music a place loud enough to live in. Amschel Rothschild was the heir who had inherited everything: the name, the bank, the 7th generation patrilineal mandate written down on a Frankfurt deathbed in 1812, and who, at 41 in a hotel bathroom on the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré, took it all off and laid it down. He represents the final cost, in the last decade of the 20th century, of a system that had spent the previous 2 centuries proving its own permanence. By 1996, the system was still standing, and a son named for the founder was no longer. He was born on the 18th of April 1955 in Paris, the youngest child of Victor Rothschild, 3rd Baron Rothschild, a banker, a Cambridge-trained zoologist, an MI5 bomb disposal officer who had defused German devices in the basements of wartime London, and, in his last years, a chairman of the Central Policy Review staff under both Heath and Wilson. Amschel's mother was Tess Mayer, Victor's second wife, herself a former MI5 officer. Through his father, Amschel was a 6th-generation direct descendant of Mayer Amschel Rothschild, and he had been given, deliberately, the founder's name. He was the half-brother of Jacob Rothschild, the 4th Baron, and the youngest of the small group of male cousins, who, by the 1970s, were understood inside the family to be the eventual succession to the London Bank. His childhood was not the bank. He went to Eton, to Oxford very briefly, and then, in his early 20s, into journalism. For several years, he was the circulation manager of the small literary magazine, The New Review. In his late 20s, he moved to Rushbrook, a farm in Suffolk, and farmed it. He was raised, like all of them, in the houses Hannah Rothschild would later describe as having killed noise, even the noise of children, and he showed throughout his 20s no particular appetite for entering the building on St Swithin's Lane that his ancestor had bought for the family in 1809. In 1981, aged 26, he married Anita Patience Guinness, a member of the Anglo-Irish brewing family, herself an heiress in her own right. They had 3 children, Kate, Alice, who would later marry the British politician Zack Goldsmith, and James. The marriage was happy. The Suffolk life was, by every account of those who visited it, the life he genuinely wanted. In 1987, at the age of 32, he finally joined N.M. Rothschild and Sons. By 1990, he was chief executive of Rothschild Asset Management, the bank's investment arm. By 1993, he was its chairman. The succession line was now spoken aloud. Sir Evelyn de Rothschild, then chairman of the bank, told Le Monde in a 1992 interview, "If something happens to me, there is David. If something happens to him, there is Amschel, the youngest. Working within the family has always been our trademark. The press was less generous. The City of London described him in profiles through the early 90s as too low profile, as lacking what one journalist called the killer instinct." Rothschild Asset Management was posting losses. Family pressure to perform, never spoken, always present, increased. His mother Tess died in May of 1996. 6 weeks later, on the morning of Monday the 8th of July, he flew to Paris for a routine series of meetings. He was scheduled to dine that evening with his cousin David de Rothschild, the head of the Paris house. He checked into a 4th-floor suite at the Hôtel Le Bristol, 112 Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré, in the 8th arrondissement, 2 blocks from the British Embassy and 3 blocks from the Élysée Palace. Slow this afternoon down. The Bristol on a July afternoon, the small inner courtyard with its trimmed hedges, the gilt of the lobby, the discreet movement of staff. A businessman in a dark suit moving through the corridors and the lift. The 4th-floor suite, clean and quiet, the windows giving onto the courtyard. The toweling dressing gown hanging on its hook in the bathroom. The standard-issue Bristol robe with a long, soft, tied belt of the same fabric. At approximately 6 in the afternoon, a chambermaid arrived at the door of the suite with fresh towels for the bathroom. The door opened. Amschel took the towels at the threshold. He said nothing. He closed the door. The chambermaid moved on. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, the same chambermaid returned on the standard turn-down round to prepare the bed for the night. She knocked. There was no answer. She knocked again. There was no answer. With the master key, she let herself in. She found him in the bathroom, fully clothed, dead. The toweling belt of the hotel dressing gown had been tied around his neck and looped through the rail above the towel rack. He was effectively kneeling on the bathroom floor. There was no note. The first family statement, issued the next morning, said heart attack. By Thursday the 11th of July, the Paris police had completed their forensic examination and the family withdrew the heart attack line. The funeral was held at Rushbrook. The London inquest opened on the 9th of August 1996 before the Westminster coroner, Dr. Paul Knapman. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Ian West, testified that the post-mortem had found neck marks consistent with hanging. There were, Knapman ruled, no sinister circumstances surrounding Mr. Rothschild's death. He recorded a verdict of suicide. Anita's written statement, read into the inquest record by her solicitor, contained the sentence that became the documentary fact of his death. His family had noticed that he had depressive tendencies. We do not know the reason for this, but certain family antecedents predisposed him to this act. The loss of his mother had affected him. Family antecedents. The phrase, in the context of a London coroner's court on a Friday morning in August 1996, meant several things. It meant his great-uncle Charles Rothschild, who in October 1923 had locked the bathroom door at Ashton Wold and cut his own throat. It meant Charles's daughter Pannonica, who had walked out of her marriage in 1951 and was buried 8 years before this inquest in the Hudson River. It meant Walter, Charles's brother, who had paid 40 years of blackmail to a woman whose name nobody in the family had ever permitted to be spoken aloud. It meant, if you went back far enough, Hannah Mayer Fitzroy, who had been wiped from the family memory in 1839 as if she had never existed, and whose grave at Hanwell still lay miles from the Rothschild stones at Willesden. The pattern, after almost 2 centuries, was finally being named, at a coroner's table, by the widow of the 7th generation heir. Sir Evelyn de Rothschild postponed all further succession plans. David de Rothschild emerged from the Paris house as the eventual successor. In 2003, the Paris and London houses would merge to form Rothschild and Company, the structure that exists today. Alexandra de Rothschild has chaired that firm since 2018. In a final detail that the press at the time noted with a quiet horror, friends of Amschel reported that, in the closing months of his life, he had been urging wealthy acquaintances to give money to the Samaritans. They had named him for the founder, and he had carried the name as far as a hotel bathroom in Paris. Far enough in the end to know it could not be carried any further. 2 centuries, 4 lives. The pattern, watched in sequence, becomes visible. A system designed for permanence kept generating people who could not survive within it. Mayer Amschel's deathbed treaty in 1812 built a bundle of arrows and called it Concordia, and the bundle did, by every external measure, hold. The bank survived. The fortune compounded. The name 200 years later still opens the doors of capitals. But every generation an arrow worked itself loose, and the looser arrows were not failures of the system. They were, on a long enough timescale, what the system produced. The system has, in the end, begun to change. N.M. Rothschild and Sons admitted its first non-family partner in 1960. Saskia de Rothschild became, in 2018, the first woman in history to chair a first-growth Bordeaux estate. The patrilineal banking clause of Mayer Amschel's 1812 testament has been quietly retired across all the surviving branches. The bundle has loosened by necessity, by exhaustion, by the slow recognition, perhaps, that a closed system that keeps producing escapees is not, in the long run, closed. Every great dynasty eventually faces the same choice the Rothschilds faced 4 times across 2 centuries. Change the rules, or watch the rules break the heirs. There is one final detail easy to miss in the heraldry. The 5 arrows that Mayer Amschel chose for the family crest in 1812 point downward on the English Rothschild shield and upward on the French. A small heraldic divergence until you watch 2 centuries of heirs across both branches and notice that the arrows were always going in different directions, and the family, whatever its mottos, whatever its testaments, whatever its silences, had perhaps known it all along. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss out on more stories like this.